My name is Esperanza Morales. I am 43 years old, and right now I am sitting on the edge of my bed in a small apartment in Queens, New York. It is 3 in the morning, and I cannot sleep. Again. The air conditioner hums with that metallic noise I know by heart, but it can't cool the suffocating heat that tightens my chest. Outside, the city sirens remind me that it never rests, just like me. The room smells of cheap detergent and the corn tortillas I heated up for dinner. My hands shake as I hold a cup of cold coffee I forgot to drink hours ago. The yellowish light from the table lamp casts long shadows on the bare walls, where only a faded photograph of my children when they were little hangs. In the picture, Alejandro is 5, and Maria is barely 3. Now Alejandro is 22, and Maria is 20, and when I spoke to them on the phone last week, they treated me like a stranger. The mattress sinks under my weight, and I can feel every spring digging into my back. The comforter I bought at a thrift store has a strange smell, like dampness and someone else's perfume. My bare feet touch the cold linoleum floor that is peeling away at the corners. Every detail in this room reminds me that after 17 years in the United States, I am still a stranger. But what hurts the most, what keeps me awake every night, is knowing that if I went back to Mexico tomorrow, I would be a stranger there too. That's the truth that has haunted me since I tried to go home 6 months ago. All my life, I was afraid of deportation, but it turned out that the scariest thing was going back to my country and realizing that I was already a stranger there. I close my eyes and let the memories take me back to the beginning, when everything was different, when Mexico was my home, and I was Esperanza Morales de Villanueva, not the silent woman who cleans offices in Manhattan and counts the days until she can send money to a family that no longer knows her. I was born in San Miguel de Allende, Guanajuato, in an adobe house with thick walls that kept it cool during the day and warm during the cold December nights. I remember the smell of freshly made tortillas that my mother prepared on the clay griddle every morning at 5 o'clock, when the neighbor's rooster woke us up with his loud crowing. The smoke from the charcoal mixed with the aroma of coffee boiling on the wood stove, creating that mixture that even today, after so many years, is still the smell of home to me. My father, Joaquin Morales, was a tall, thin man with huge hands weathered from working in construction. He used to whistle songs by Jose Alfredo Jimenez while shaving in front of the broken bathroom mirror, using a razor he had inherited from his father. His brown eyes always sparkled when he saw me coming home from school, and he would always ask me, "So, what did my doctor learn today?" Because he always told me that I was going to be a doctor, that I was going to go to college, and that I would never have to work with my hands like him. My mother, Guadalupe, was small but strong, with black hair always pulled back in a braid that reached her waist. She had the softest hands in the world, even though she spent all day in soapy water washing other people's clothes. She sang while she worked, always the same songs her mother had taught her, with a sweet voice that could be heard throughout the house. When I was sick, she would rub Vicks VapoRub on my chest and make me chamomile tea with honey, whispering that everything would be all right until I fell asleep. Our house had 3 small rooms and a patio where my mother grew cilantro, mint, and chili peppers. In the afternoons, after doing my homework, I would sit in the yard and watch her water the plants with a leaky tin watering can. The floor was packed earth that turned to mud when it rained, but on dry days, it had that particular smell that only earth has when it is dry and warm. On Sundays, we went to Mass at St. Michael the Archangel Parish. I wore my blue dress with white lace that my mother had sewn by hand, and I sat between my parents on the wooden benches that creaked every time someone moved. The incense made me a little dizzy, but I liked to hear the echo of the voices singing the Hail Mary in that big church that made me feel so small. After Mass, we would walk through the main garden, where my father would buy me corn with chili and lemon from Doña Carmen, a fat lady who always pinched my cheeks and told me I was too skinny. The corn was so hot it burned my tongue, but I didn't care because it tasted like heaven. My mother would wipe my face with her handkerchief, which always smelled like rose water, and the three of us would sit on a bench and watch the people go by. Benito Juarez Elementary School was 6 blocks from my house, and every day I walked down the cobblestone streets carrying my cloth backpack that my mother had made from scraps of different colors. Teacher Rosario was an older woman, very strict, who wore thick glasses and always had a wooden ruler in her hand. But she loved me very much because I was a good student and always turned in my homework clean and on time. At recess, I played with my best friend, Lupita Hernandez, playing house with pebbles and leaves we picked up from the playground. She always wanted to be the mother, and I was the daughter, even though I was taller. We would sit under the big mesquite tree that shaded half the school and build little houses with sticks and dirt. Lupita told me that when she grew up, she was going to marry Pedrito Sanchez, the green-eyed boy in the classroom next door, and that she was going to have 5 children. I told her I didn't want to get married, that I wanted to study medicine like I had seen on a soap opera where the main character was a doctor and saved lives. My dream was to have a white coat like Dr. Martinez, who cured me when I had pneumonia when I was 8. He was very kind and always smelled like clean medicine. When he put the stethoscope on my chest, he explained that he was listening to my heart. And I thought it was the most wonderful thing in the world to be able to hear life beating inside people. In the afternoons, after school, I helped my mother with her chores. I swept the patio with a palm broom that weighed more than I did, and I dusted the furniture with a damp cloth. My mother taught me how to make tortillas when I was 9. At first, they burned or came out crooked, but she was very patient. She would place her hands over mine and guide me as I spread the dough. Like that, sweetie? With love? Because tortillas made with love taste better. On Saturday afternoons, my father took me to the market to buy groceries for the week. We walked among the fruit and vegetable stalls, where the vendors shouted their prices and the women haggled. I liked Don Alberto's stall, where he sold traditional sweets. He always gave me a tamarind candy or a coconut candy and told me I was the prettiest girl in the market. My father laughed and replied that he would have to take good care of me when I grew up, because boys would be chasing after me. When I turned 13, my body began to change, and my mother had to buy me my first bra at Doña Esperanza's store. I was very embarrassed that all the women in town knew I was a young lady now. But my mother told me it was part of becoming a woman and that I should be proud. In high school, I met Roberto Villanueva, a tall, dark-skinned boy who was 2 years ahead of me. He had a smile that made my stomach flutter, and when he saw me at recess, he always waved at me. One day he came up to me when I was alone reading under the mango tree and asked me if I wanted to be his girlfriend. I turned as red as a tomato and couldn't say yes or no. I just nodded my head. Roberto visited me on Sunday afternoons, always very formal, asking my parents for permission to sit with me in the yard. My mother watched us from the kitchen while she shelled beans or sewed, and my father read the newspaper in his rocking chair, coughing occasionally to remind us he was there. Roberto told me about his plans to work at his uncle's blacksmith shop when he finished high school, and how we were going to get married when I turned 18. but I kept dreaming of studying medicine. At night, when everyone was asleep, I would light a candle and read science books that my teacher Elena had lent me. I memorized the names of bones and organs, imagining that one day I would be able to heal people like Dr. Martinez. I wrote letters to universities in Guadalajara and Mexico City, asking for information about medical programs, even though I knew my family couldn't afford to pay for my education. At 16, Roberto and I were already talking seriously about getting married. He had found a job at the blacksmith's and was earning enough to rent a small house on the street behind the church. It was a 2-room house with a cement floor and its own bathroom, a luxury for us. My mother began to teach me how to embroider sheets and make tablecloths for my future home, and the neighbors gave me dishes and other things for when I got married. But part of me resisted. At night, I cried silently, thinking that if I got married so young, I would never be able to study medicine. I told my teacher Elena about my doubts, and she said something I will never forget. Esperanza. Love is beautiful, but education is forever. If he really loves you, Roberto will wait for you to finish your studies. Despite my doubts, I married Roberto when I turned 18 in a simple ceremony at the parish church of San Miguel. My mother lent me her wedding dress, which she had kept wrapped in tissue paper for 25 years. It smelled of mothballs and was a little yellow, but it was the most beautiful dress I had ever seen. My father cried when he saw me in my wedding dress, and he told me that I would always be his little girl, even though I was now a married woman. The first night in our new little house was strange. Roberto had put fresh flowers in a soda bottle on the table and had bought new sheets that smelled like the store. I was very nervous because my mother had only half explained to me what happened between husband and wife, and Roberto was also nervous, although he tried to hide it. We stayed up late whispering, as if we were afraid of waking someone, even though we were alone. The first months of marriage were difficult. I didn't know how to cook for 2 people and always made too much food or too little. Roberto would come home tired from the blacksmith's shop, his hands black with grease and smelling of hot metal, and I would try to have dinner ready, although many times it would burn or be undercooked. But he never complained, always telling me that everything was delicious and that I was the best wife in the world. 6 months after we got married, I realized I was pregnant. The smell of coffee in the morning made me nauseous, and I started to feel a strange tiredness that lasted all day. When I told Roberto, he picked me up and carried me around the house, shouting that he was going to be a father. That night, we made plans about what our baby would be like. Whether he would have my eyes or his. Whether he would be a doctor like I wanted to be or a blacksmith like his father. The pregnancy was difficult. I threw up every morning until there was nothing left in my stomach. And then I felt dizzy for the rest of the day. My mother came to take care of me when Roberto went to work. She made me mint tea for the nausea and rubbed my back when it hurt. She told me stories about when she was pregnant with me and assured me that everything I was feeling was normal. Alejandro was born on a December night when the air was so cold we could see our breath. Roberto ran to find the midwife, Doña Carmen, because we didn't have money to go to the hospital. The labor lasted 12 hours and was the most intense pain I had ever felt in my life. But when I heard his first cry, it was all worth it. He was small and wrinkled, with hair as black as coal and the most beautiful eyes in the world. 2 years later, Maria was born on a sunny afternoon in May. The birth was easier this time, although we also had to stay at home with Doña Carmen. Maria was chubbier than Alejandro and had less hair, but she was also beautiful. Roberto was overjoyed with his 2 children and spent his afternoons playing with them in the yard, while I prepared dinner. But as the years went by, I began to realize that we never had enough money. Roberto worked from sunrise to sunset at the blacksmith shop, but his salary was barely enough to feed us and pay the rent. When the children got sick, we had to borrow money to take them to the doctor. Alejandro needed new shoes for school, and Maria had grown so much that her clothes were too small for her. I sewed and mended until I couldn't anymore. But there were things that couldn't be fixed with a needle and thread. One night, after eating refried beans for the 5th time that week because we couldn't afford meat, Roberto and I sat down to talk seriously about our future. The children were already asleep, and we stayed at the kitchen table with a candle lit because the power had been cut off for non-payment. Esperanza, Roberto said, taking my hands in his. We can't go on like this. The children deserve more than we can give them here. I knew where this conversation was going. We had heard stories of people from the town who had gone north to the United States and sent dollars back to their families. Don Patricio, Elena's brother, had left 3 years earlier and had already sent enough money for his family to build a new 2-story house. What are you thinking? I asked, even though I already knew the answer. I'm thinking about going north, he said, without letting go of my hands. Work there for a few years, send money back so you can live comfortably with the kids, and then come back and start my own business. The idea terrified me. I had heard terrible stories of people who got lost in the desert, who were deported, who never returned. But I had also heard of families who had gotten ahead thanks to the dollars sent by those who had left. What if something happens to you? I asked, with tears in my eyes. Nothing will happen to me, he replied, although I could see the fear in his eyes. I'll be very careful. And in 2 years, 3 at most, I'll come back with enough money to buy a house and start my own blacksmith shop. That night we couldn't sleep. We lay in bed hugging each other, feeling the warmth of each other's bodies, memorizing every sensation, because we knew we would soon be apart. Roberto stroked my hair and whispered that everything would be all right. But I could feel his tears wet my neck. Over the next few weeks, we looked for information on how to make the trip. Roberto talked to people who knew coyotes, asked about prices and routes. The cost was $3,000, a fortune for us. We had to sell our few pieces of furniture, borrow from relatives, and I even sold the jewelry my mother had given me for my wedding. The 2 weeks before Roberto left were the hardest of my life up to that point. Every day felt like it was the last, and I tried to commit every gesture, every word, every smile to memory. In the mornings, when he left for work, I would stand at the window, watching until he disappeared around the corner, with a lump in my throat that made it hard to breathe. We packed his suitcase together, folding each item of clothing carefully. I put a small picture of the Virgin of Guadalupe in his shirt pocket, and he promised me he would always carry it with him. I also gave him a photo of us on our wedding day, smiling in front of the church, and a photo of the children that had been taken at school. The children didn't fully understand what was happening. Alejandro, who was already 5, asked why Daddy was going so far away, and I told him it was to bring us gifts and that he would be back soon. Maria, who was only 3, kept asking when Daddy was coming back, and I didn't know what to say. Roberto spent every afternoon playing with them, as if he wanted to treasure every moment. He taught Alejandro to whistle like him and Maria to make figures out of plasticine. He carried them in turn and sang them the songs his father had sung to him when he was a child. I watched them from the kitchen while I prepared dinner, and I had to turn away so they wouldn't see me crying. One afternoon, Roberto took Alejandro to the blacksmith shop to teach him how to work with metal. When they returned, Alejandro was very excited. telling me how his dad had made an iron horse just for him. Roberto had spent the entire afternoon teaching his son his trade, knowing that it would be the last time in a long time. The night before he left, I cooked all his favorite dishes: chicken mole, red rice, beans from the pot, and freshly made tortillas. I invited my parents and Roberto's brothers to have dinner together. The house was filled with voices and laughter. But underneath all that forced joy, we all knew it was a farewell. The day Roberto left dawned cloudy, as if even the sky was sad. I got up before him to make him coffee and his favorite breakfast: huevos rancheros with salsa verde and refried beans. But neither of us could eat much. Our stomachs were tied up with nerves. The children got up later and ate breakfast as if it were a normal day, unaware that when they came home from school, their dad would be gone. Roberto kissed them goodbye at the door, gave them an extra long hug, and told them to be good to their mom. Alejandro promised he would take care of me. And Maria gave him a drawing she had made of the whole family holding hands. After the children left for school, Roberto and I were left alone in the house, which suddenly felt too quiet. He checked his suitcase for the 10th time, making sure he had everything he needed: clothes, the picture of the Virgin Mary, the photos, his identity documents, and the little money he had left after paying the coyote. At 2 p.m, Don Esteban arrived, the man who was going to take him to the border in his truck. He was an older man, weathered by the sun, who spoke little but inspired confidence. Roberto said goodbye to my parents, who had come to accompany us. My father gave him a big hug and said, "Take care of yourself, son. We'll be waiting for you here." My mother put her hands on his cheeks and said, "May God bless you and protect you on your journey." When it was time to say goodbye, I felt like the world was falling apart. Roberto hugged me so tightly that I could hardly breathe, and I clung to him as if that would keep him from leaving. We cried together, not caring that Don Esteban and my parents were watching us. "I love you, Esperanza," he whispered in my ear. "I'll think of you and the children every day, and I'll come back as soon as I can." "I love you too," I replied, my voice breaking. "Please be careful. The children and I need you." We kissed one last time, long and salty from our tears, and then he picked up his suitcase and walked to the truck. He got in without looking back at me, because he knew that if he saw me again, he wouldn't have the strength to leave. Don Esteban started the engine, and I stood at the door watching the truck drive away down the cobblestone street. My parents hugged me and took me inside, but I couldn't stop looking out the window, as if I expected Roberto to have changed his mind and come back. The house smelled like him, like his cheap cologne and the soap he used to wash his hands after work. That night, when the kids came home from school and asked about Dad, I told them he had gone on a trip, but that he would call soon. The first few days after Roberto left were terrible. The house felt too big and too quiet. In the mornings, when I woke up, for a moment I forgot that he was gone, and I reached out to his side of the bed, hoping to find him. But all I found were cold sheets and the pillow that still held his scent. The children missed their dad terribly. Alejandro asked me every day when Dad was going to call, and Maria cried at night, asking for Dad to come tuck her in. I tried to be strong in front of them, but when they fell asleep, I would go to the bathroom to cry where they couldn't hear me. A week after he left, Roberto was finally able to call from a payphone in Tijuana. His voice sounded distant and choppy, but it was the most beautiful voice I had ever heard in my life. He told me that the trip had been difficult, but that he had made it to the border safely, and that in a few days he would try to cross to the other side. "How are the kids?" he asked me. "They miss you very much," I replied, trying not to cry. "Alejandro wants to talk to you." I put Alejandro on the phone, and he told his dad about school, about how he had helped his mom wash the dishes, and about the little iron horse he carried everywhere. Then Maria spoke too, although she didn't really understand why her dad was on the phone, but not at home. That was the last time we spoke before he tried to cross the border. The following days were filled with anguish. Every time the neighbor's phone rang, I ran thinking it was him, but it never was. At night I couldn't sleep, imagining the worst, praying entire rosaries for the Virgin to protect him. 10 days after Roberto's last call, when I was desperate and considering borrowing money to go to Tijuana to look for him, the phone finally rang at Doña Remedios, our neighbor's house. It was 7 o'clock in the evening, and I was bathing Maria when I heard Doña Remedios shouting my name from the street. I ran barefoot with Maria wrapped in a towel, and when I picked up the phone, I heard Roberto's voice, but it sounded different, more tired, more distant. "Esperanza, my love, I'm on the other side," he said, and I felt my legs go weak with relief. "Thank God," I shouted, not caring that Doña Remedios and half the neighborhood could hear me. "Are you okay? Did anything happen to you?" "I'm fine, my love." But it was very difficult. We walked for 3 days in the desert. We almost ran out of water, and we had to hide from the migrant twice. But I'm here now, in a place called Phoenix, Arizona. He told me it had been the most difficult journey of his life. They had walked through the desert at night, guided only by the stars and the coyotes' instructions. It was terribly cold at night and unbearably hot during the day. There were times when he thought he wouldn't make it, but he kept going, thinking of us. I told the Virgin Mary that if she helped me get there, I would work very hard to send you money, he said. And here I am, my love. I already found a job in construction, and as soon as I get paid for the first week, I'll send you money. That night, I slept better than I had in weeks. Roberto was alive. He was on the other side, and soon we would receive the first dollars. Everything was going to get better, I was sure of it. Roberto kept his promise. 2 weeks after that call, the first Western Union money order arrived. $200, which was more money than we had seen together in years. I went to pick it up, trembling with excitement. And when the lady at the counter handed me the bills, I couldn't believe it was real. With that money, I was able to buy new shoes for the children, pay off our debts at the grocery store, and even buy chicken for dinner. That night, we had a little celebration, and Alejandro asked me if that meant that Dad was coming home soon. "Soon, my love," I lied. Because the truth was that Roberto had told me he needed to stay at least 2 years to save enough money. The money orders arrived every 2 weeks, always on time, and always accompanied by a call from Roberto telling me about his new life. He lived in a small room with 5 other men, all Mexicans like him. He slept in a bunk bed and shared a bathroom that was always dirty. He worked in construction from 6 in the morning until 6 in the evening, under a sun that was different from the one in Mexico, more cruel and merciless. "It's very hard, Esperanza," he would tell me on the phone. "I work harder than I've ever worked in my life, and the language is very difficult, but the dollars are worth it. What I earn here in a week, I didn't earn in a month back home." I told him about the children, about how Alejandro had learned to read better, about how Maria could already write her name. I sent him photos by mail, and he sent me postcards of places he visited on Sundays, his only day off. But as the months went by, something began to change in our conversations. Roberto sounded more tired, more distant, as if he were losing part of himself in that strange country. And I felt myself changing too. The responsibility of raising the children alone, of making all the decisions, of being both father and mother, was making me stronger, but also harder. 8 months after Roberto left, I received a call that changed everything. It was him, but he sounded different, more excited than I had heard him in months. "Esperanza, I have news," he said. "I met a man here, Don Carlos, who has experience helping families reunite. He says he can bring you and the children here for $5,000. My heart stopped. We had never talked about me leaving too. The plan had always been for him to work for a few years and then come back. Do you want us to go?" I asked, confused. "Esperanza, there are opportunities here that we'll never have there. The children can study, they can become whatever they want. You could study medicine like you always wanted to. Here, if we both work, in 5 years, we can have our own house, our own business." The idea terrified me and excited me at the same time. On the one hand, it meant being together again as a family. On the other hand, it meant leaving everything I knew, risking my children's lives on that dangerous journey, and going to a country where I didn't speak the language and didn't know anyone. "I need to think about it," I said. "Okay, honey, but don't take too long. Don Carlos says it's best to travel before the summer heat sets in." That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake watching my children sleep, thinking about all the possibilities. What if something happened to us on the way? What if we were separated? What if the United States wasn't everything Roberto said it was? But I also thought about the opportunities, about Alejandro being able to go to college without us having to sell the house, about Maria being able to be whatever she wanted to be, about me maybe, after so many years, being able to study medicine. A week later, I told Roberto yes. Once I made the decision to leave with the children, everything happened so fast it made me dizzy. Roberto had saved enough money for the trip, and Don Carlos, the coyote, gave us a date. We would leave on April 15th, when the desert temperature would still be bearable for the children. The hardest part was deciding what to take and what to leave behind. A whole life fit into 2 small backpacks. I packed the essentials: clothes for a few days, the children's medicines, important documents, and the few family photos we had. Maria wanted to take all her dolls, but I only allowed her one, the one she loved the most. Alejandro packed the iron horse his father had made for him and a storybook he liked very much. I had to sell everything we had built up over years of marriage. The furniture, the appliances, even the kitchen dishes. Every item I sold hurt as if a piece of my soul was being torn away. The table where we had eaten dinner as a family, the bed where my children were born, the wardrobe that Roberto had made with his own hands. The neighbors watched me pack with a mixture of envy and pity. Envy because I was going to the land of opportunity. Pity because they knew how dangerous the trip was with small children. Doña Carmen, the woman who sold corn on the cob, gave me a little picture of San Cristobal, the saint of travelers, and made me promise that I would take good care of them. Saying goodbye to my parents was heartbreaking. My mother cried inconsolably, hugging the children as if she would never see them again. My father, who had always been a strong man, couldn't stop shaking when he gave me one last hug. "Take good care of my grandchildren," he whispered in my ear. "And take care of yourself too. If anything goes wrong, Come back immediately." "Yes, Dad," I promised, even though deep down I knew there was no turning back. If we left, it was forever. The trip to the border took 2 days on buses that smelled of sweat and stale food. The children got carsick several times, and Maria cried every half hour, asking to go to the bathroom. I carried a bag of cookies and water, trying to keep them fed and calm. In Tijuana, we stayed 3 days in a safe house that was actually hell. There were more than 20 of us crammed into 3 small rooms with no ventilation and only 1 bathroom. The smell was nauseating, a mixture of unwashed bodies, rotten food, and fear. The children didn't understand why we were there, why we couldn't leave, why I was so nervous. Don Carlos came to see us on the second night to explain the plan. He was a small, dark-skinned man with scars on his hands and a way of speaking that made me distrust him. He told us that we were going to walk through the desert for 2 nights, that we should take only the bare essentials, and that the children could not cry or make any noise because we could be discovered. "What if my children can't walk that far?" I asked. "You'll help them," he replied curtly. "Either they stay or they all come. There are no half measures." That night, I hugged my children and explained that we were going to play a very important game. We had to walk in silence, like Indian hunters, and at the end of the game, we would meet up with Dad. "Is it very far where Dad is?" Alejandro asked me. "A little far," I lied, "but we'll get there." The first night of walking was the most terrifying experience of my life. We left at 9 o'clock at night, when it was already completely dark. There were 12 of us. Don Carlos, another younger coyote, 6 single men, a couple without children, and the 3 of us. The first few miles were relatively easy because we walked on marked trails. But then the terrain became rocky and dangerous. Maria, who was only 4 years old, got tired quickly, and I had to carry her. Alejandro, brave as always, walked beside me, holding my hand, stumbling every now and then, but not complaining. It was terribly cold. The desert at night is unforgiving, and we hadn't brought enough warm clothes. The children were shivering, and I hugged them close to my body, trying to keep them warm. Every hour, we stopped for 10 minutes to drink water and rest. But Don Carlos constantly hurried us along. "Let's go. The migra might catch us," he said, shining a small flashlight that was barely visible. At 3 in the morning, Maria couldn't take it anymore. She cried quietly, as I had taught her. But it was a heart-wrenching cry of exhaustion and cold. One of the men, an elderly man from Oaxaca, offered to carry her for a while so I could rest. His kind gesture gave me the strength to go on. When dawn broke, we hid under some thorny bushes that scratched our skin. We were forbidden to speak, make noise, or move throughout the day. The children didn't understand why they had to be so still, and I made up stories in whispers to keep them calm. The heat of the day was unbearable. The desert sun is unlike any sun I had ever felt before. It burns your skin in minutes and drains your energy. We had little water and food, and the children were constantly thirsty. Maria developed a fever, and I had nothing to give her except warm water from the bottle we were carrying. The second night was worse than the first. Maria could barely walk because of the fever, and Alejandro also began to show signs of exhaustion. I carried them in turns for miles, until I felt that my legs would no longer support me. My shoulders hurt so much that I thought they were going to dislocate, but I couldn't stop. In the middle of the night, we heard sirens in the distance. Don Carlos told us to lie down on the ground and remain completely still. The children were terrified, and I covered them with my body, whispering that everything would be okay, even though I was scared to death myself. The sirens faded away, but Don Carlos decided we had to change our route. That meant walking 3 hours longer than planned. By then, I was running on pure adrenaline and maternal love. Every step was an act of faith, a prayer to the Virgin of Guadalupe to protect us. When we finally saw the lights of the American city in the distance, I began to cry with relief. We had walked for 2 whole nights, risking our lives, but we had made it. My children were going to have the chance for a better future. I stepped onto U.S. soil at 4 a.m. on a Wednesday in April, carrying Maria, who had fallen asleep from exhaustion, and holding Alejandro's hand as he walked like a brave little soldier. The ground felt the same as Mexico, but I knew that everything had changed forever. Don Carlos took us to an abandoned house where we waited until dawn. There, a man in a pickup truck that smelled of diesel and cigarettes picked us up. We climbed into the back, hiding under dirty tarps, and drove for hours until we reached Phoenix. When we finally reached the city and I could see buildings, avenues, and cars, I felt a strange mixture of relief and terror. We were safe, but we were in a completely unknown world. The signs were in a language I didn't understand. The people on the street looked different. Even the air smelled different. Roberto was waiting for us at a gas station on the outskirts of Phoenix. When I saw him come out of the shadows where he had been hiding, I thought I was going to faint from the emotion. He had lost weight. He was darker from working under the sun. But it was my Roberto, my husband, the father of my children. The children ran toward him shouting, "Daddy, Daddy!" And he picked them both up at the same time, crying like a child. I stood there watching them, recording that moment in my memory forever. After 10 months of separation, we were finally together again. "You did it, my love," Roberto said, hugging me with the children in between us. "We're all together now. We're safe." But as he hugged me, I looked around and realized that being safe was only the first step. Now we had to learn to live in this strange country. We had to survive. We had to build a new life from scratch. That first night, the 4 of us slept in a single bed in the room Roberto shared with 5 other men. The children fell asleep immediately, exhausted from the journey. But Roberto and I stayed awake, whispering about what would come next. "Do you think we did the right thing?" I asked him. "We're alive, we're together, and our children are going to have opportunities we never had," he replied. Yes, we did the right thing. But I had a strange feeling in my chest, as if I had left something important behind and didn't know exactly what it was. The first 3 months in Phoenix were the hardest of our lives. Roberto had found a small 1-bedroom apartment in a Mexican neighborhood, but it was still way out of our price range. We paid $400 a month for a space that was barely bigger than the living room in our house in Mexico. The apartment was in an old complex where mostly immigrants like us lived. The walls were thin, and we could hear the neighbors talking, arguing, crying. The air conditioning didn't work well, and in the Arizona summer, the heat was unbearable. At night, we put the kids to sleep on the bathroom floor because it was the coolest place in the apartment. I got a job cleaning houses with a Salvadoran woman named Marta, who knew the business. She paid me $30 per house, and on a good day, I could clean 3 houses. Roberto was still working in construction, but now he was earning a little more because he knew some English and could communicate better with his supervisors. The children had to adapt to a completely new world. I enrolled them in an elementary school where most of the teachers spoke Spanish, but it was still difficult for them. Alejandro, who had always been outgoing, became quiet and shy. Maria cried every morning when I dropped her off at kindergarten, clinging to my leg as if she were afraid I wouldn't come back for her. The language barrier was our biggest obstacle. Going to the supermarket was an adventure. I didn't understand the product labels. I didn't know how to ask for help. And I often came home with things I didn't want to buy. Once I bought salt thinking it was sugar because the containers looked similar. When I tasted the coffee in the morning and it was salty, I started crying out of frustration. But the children learned English at an astonishing rate. Within 2 months, Alejandro could translate basic conversations for me, and Maria sang songs in English that she had learned at school. They became my interpreters when I had to talk to teachers, doctors, or anyone who didn't speak Spanish. After the first year, we started to find our rhythm. I had gotten more cleaning clients and raised my rates to $40 per house. Roberto had been promoted to supervisor at his construction job, which meant a raise and more stable hours. We developed routines that gave us a sense of normalcy. On Mondays, I cleaned the homes of my regular clients in Scottsdale, an affluent neighborhood where the ladies treated me well and sometimes gave me clothes they no longer wore. On Tuesdays and Thursdays, I worked for a cleaning company that cleaned offices in downtown Phoenix. Wednesdays and Fridays were for new clients or special jobs. Roberto left the house at 5 in the morning and returned at 6 in the evening. Exhausted but satisfied because he knew that every day of work brought us closer to our goals. On weekends, we went to the Mexican market to buy ingredients to cook the dishes we missed. And on Sundays, we went to Mass at a church where the priest was from Michoacan and understood what it meant to be far from home. The children adapted better than we had expected. Alejandro became the best student in his class and started talking about wanting to be an engineer. Maria made friends quickly and no longer cried when I dropped her off at school. Both spoke English without an accent, something that filled me with pride and at the same time hurt me, because it meant they were becoming more American than Mexican. In the evenings, after dinner, we would sit in the small living room of our apartment and each of us would talk about our day. Alejandro would tell us about his classes, Maria about her friends, Roberto about the buildings he was constructing. And I would talk about the houses I had cleaned and the people I had met. But there were also difficult nights. Nights when we called Mexico and my parents sounded older and more distant. Nights when the children asked when we were going to visit their grandparents. And I didn't know what to say, because the truth was that we couldn't go back. Nights when I lay awake doing calculations, figuring out how much money we needed to save, how much to send to Mexico, how much for the month's expenses. After 3 years in Phoenix, we had made more progress than we had dared to dream. Roberto had saved enough money to buy a used truck, which meant we no longer depended on public transportation. I had expanded my client list and was now earning between $800 and $1,000 a month, an amount that would have been unthinkable in Mexico. Not only had the children learned English perfectly, but they were excelling in school. Alejandro had entered a program for gifted students, and Maria had won a writing contest with a story about a girl who traveled from Mexico to the United States to be reunited with her father. We decided to move to a larger apartment in a better neighborhood. It was a 2-bedroom place in a newer complex with working air conditioning and a pool where the kids could swim on weekends. The first day we walked into our new home, we sat on the floor of the empty living room and hugged each other, knowing we had accomplished something important. I started taking English classes at the community center on Saturday mornings. The teacher was an older woman named Helen, who had been a teacher for 40 years before retiring. She was patient and kind, and she understood how hard it was to learn a new language as an adult. Slowly, I began to communicate better with my clients and feel less lost in the American world. Roberto had also started talking about starting his own construction business. He had made contacts in the industry and learned about the necessary permits and licenses. His dream was to be his own boss and hire other immigrants like us, hard-working people who deserved a chance. But as our financial situation improved, I began to notice that something else was changing. The children spoke English to each other, even at home. They preferred American food to Mexican food. Alejandro corrected me when I mispronounced a word in English, with an impatience that hurt me. Maria had started saying she didn't want to visit Mexico because she was afraid of crossing the desert again. And I was changing too. I was becoming more independent, more confident. I was making decisions that I had always consulted Roberto about before. I managed our finances, talked to the children's teachers, negotiated prices with my clients. It was a version of myself I didn't know. Stronger, but also lonelier. By our 5th year in the United States, we had achieved things that seemed impossible when we arrived. Roberto had started his own construction company with 2 employees. I had expanded my cleaning business and now had 15 regular clients. We had saved enough money for a down payment on a house and were looking in a middle-class neighborhood where the children could go to better schools. Alejandro was already 12 and talked about going to college to study engineering. Maria, 10, had developed an incredible talent for art and took painting classes on Saturdays. They both looked, talked, and thought like American kids. When I asked them about Mexico, they responded with stories that were clearly more constructed than what they remembered. But progress came at a price I hadn't anticipated. Calls to Mexico had become more sporadic and more tense. My mother complained that she didn't call them as often anymore, and that when she spoke to the children, they answered in English and she couldn't understand them. My father had developed diabetes and high blood pressure, but I couldn't go take care of him because I didn't have papers to travel. One Sunday afternoon, as I was preparing pozole the way my mother used to, Maria came into the kitchen and said, "Mom, why don't we make hamburgers instead? The pozole smells weird." I stood there with the spoon in my hand, feeling as if I had been slapped in the face. My own daughter, the girl I had risked my life to bring to this country, thought that the food of her culture smelled weird. "It's pozole, Maria," I said in Spanish. "It's your family's food, your grandparents' food." "But I'm American, Mom," she replied in English. "And my friends don't like Mexican food." That night, after the children were asleep, Roberto and I had a long and difficult conversation. He had noticed the changes too. The children no longer wanted us to speak Spanish in front of their friends. They were embarrassed when Roberto picked them up from school in his dirty, tool-filled pickup truck. "Did we do the right thing in bringing them here?" I asked Roberto. "We gave them opportunities," he replied, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. "They'll be able to be whatever they want to be." "But at what cost?" I insisted. "They're no longer Mexican, but they're not completely American either." "What are they?" I didn't have an answer to that question, and the truth is, none of us did. 8 years after arriving in the United States, we had achieved what anyone would consider the American dream. We bought a 3-bedroom house in a middle-class neighborhood with a yard where Maria could paint outdoors and where Roberto set up a basketball hoop for Alejandro. My cleaning business had grown so much that I hired 2 employees and stopped cleaning myself to focus on managing contracts. Roberto now had 8 employees at his construction company and was building houses in some of the best neighborhoods in Phoenix. Alejandro had been accepted into a preparatory program for outstanding students that practically guaranteed him admission to a good university. Maria had won a scholarship to take art classes at a prestigious academy. From the outside, we were the perfect immigrant family. We had arrived with nothing and built a prosperous life. Our children were succeeding. We had a house, cars, savings in the bank. But inside, something was falling apart. The children hardly spoke Spanish anymore. When we went to Mass in Spanish, they sat restless and bored. Alejandro had told me he didn't want to go to Mexican community family parties anymore because he felt out of place. Maria had started saying her name was Mary, not Maria, because it was easier for her American friends. And I felt lost between two worlds. In Mexico, when I talked to my family on the phone, they saw me as the rich American woman who had made it big. But in the United States, no matter how successful I was still the Mexican woman who cleaned houses. My clients treated me well, but always with that subtle condescension that reminds you where you belong. Roberto and I had also changed. The stress of work, the pressure to keep the business going, the constant worry about immigration papers, all of that had put a strain on our marriage that hadn't been there before. We argued about money, about the kids, about decisions we used to make together without any problems. One night, after a particularly heated argument about whether we should hire an immigration lawyer to fix our legal status, I lay awake thinking about a question that terrified me. Had we gained money and opportunities, but lost our soul? It was a Tuesday in October when I got the call that changed my perspective forever. I was reviewing my client's bills when the phone rang. It was my sister Carmen, calling from Mexico with a broken voice that immediately let me know something terrible had happened. "Esperanza," she said between sobs. "Dad is very sick. He had a heart attack 3 days ago and is in the hospital. The doctors say we don't know how much time he has left." The phone fell from my hands. My father, the man who had taught me to be strong, who had always believed in me, was dying, and I was thousands of miles away, unable to do anything. "How's Mom?" I managed to ask when I could speak again. "Very bad, Esperanza. She asks about you all the time. She says she wants to see you before Dad goes." That night I couldn't sleep. I lay awake making desperate calculations. Could I risk traveling to Mexico without papers? What would happen if they didn't let me come back? What would happen to my children, my business, everything we had built? Roberto found me crying in the kitchen at 3 in the morning. "You have to go," he said simply. "It's your father." "But if I go, I might not be able to come back," I replied. "What about the children? What about everything we've worked for? The kids and I will be fine. And if you can't come back, we'll find a way to get back to you. But if you don't go and something happens to your dad, you'll never forgive yourself." She was right, and we both knew it. After 3 days of mental agony, I made the decision to travel to Mexico. I hired an immigration lawyer who explained the risks. Since I had entered the country illegally, there was little chance that I would be allowed to return legally. But he told me that there were pardon programs in humanitarian cases, although he couldn't guarantee anything. The preparations for the trip were surreal. I had to organize my business so that it could run without me, perhaps forever. I gave my employees detailed instructions, transferred some clients to them, and left all the money I had saved in an account in Roberto's name. The hardest part was explaining to the children what was happening. Alejandro, who was already 15, understood the situation better than Maria, who was only 13. They both knew that their grandfather was ill, but they didn't fully understand the possibility that their mother might not be able to return. "How long are you going to be gone, Mom?" Maria asked me, using the word that hurt me every time I heard it from her lips. "I don't know, sweetheart," I replied honestly. "I hope it's only a few weeks, but it could be longer." "Can we go with you?" Alejandro asked. The question broke my heart because I knew the answer. They had been born in Mexico, but they had grown up in the United States. Their future was here, their friends, their school, their dreams. Taking them with me would mean ruining the opportunities we had sacrificed so much for. "No, my love. You have to stay here. Keep studying. Keep building your future. Dad will take care of you." The flight from Phoenix to Guadalajara was the longest of my life, even though it only lasted 3 hours. Every minute that passed took me further away from the life I had built and closer to a past I had left behind 10 years ago. Carmen was waiting for me at the airport, and when I saw her, I couldn't help but cry. She looked older, with more wrinkles and gray hair than I remembered, but her hug smelled the same as always, like lavender soap and home. The bus ride from Guadalajara to San Miguel de Allende showed me a Mexico that had changed a lot in my absence. There were more stores, more cars, more development, but also more poverty in some places. I felt like a stranger observing my own country through the eyes of someone who had lived elsewhere. When I arrived at the hospital where my father was staying, the smell of disinfectant and illness hit me like a slap in the face. My mother was sitting next to his bed, looking so small and fragile that I almost didn't recognize her. When she saw me come in, she started crying so hard that the nurses came to see what was wrong. "Hope, my girl, you came," she whispered as she hugged me. "Your dad was waiting for you." My father was asleep, hooked up to machines that monitored his heart and breathing. He looked very pale and thin, nothing like the strong man I remembered. When I approached his bed and took his hand, he slowly opened his eyes. "My doctor," he said with a weak smile, using the nickname he had given me when I was a child. "I knew you were coming." In that moment, I realized that I had been so focused on building a new life that I'd forgotten to take care of the life I had left behind. During the 2 weeks I spent at my father's bedside, I had time to reconnect with the Mexico I had left behind. My old friends came to visit me at the hospital, and I was surprised to see how their lives had changed. Lupita, my best friend from childhood, had married Pedrito Sanchez, just as she had always dreamed, and had 3 children who looked at me curiously when I told them I had come from the United States. "Is it true that houses there have 2 floors for just one family?" Lupita's oldest son asked me. "Son." "Some do," I replied, realizing how strange that sounded to a child who lived in a 2-room house with his entire family. But what struck me most was how disconnected I felt from everything. My friends' conversations revolved around problems and situations that I no longer fully understood. The prices of things, local politicians, town gossip, everything sounded foreign to me. One afternoon, as I walked through the streets where I had grown up, I stopped in front of my old house. The new owners had painted it blue instead of the white I remembered, and they had built a 2nd floor. I stood outside like a tourist in my own childhood, remembering the girl I had been and wondering what had become of her. That night, as I ate beans and tortillas with my mother, which tasted different from how I remembered them, she asked me a question that hurt me deeply. "Esperanza, when are you coming home to stay?" "Mom, my home is in the United States now," I replied, and the word sounded strange even to me. My children are there. My life is there. But this is also your home, she insisted. You were born here. You grew up here. Don't you miss any of this? The truth was that I did miss many things, but not in the way she expected. I missed the version of Mexico I had lived in 10 years earlier, not the reality of today. I missed being the Esperanza I had been, not the woman I had become. My father died on a quiet morning while I held his hand, and my mother prayed the rosary. His last words were to tell me that he was proud of me, that I had achieved everything he had dreamed for me, and to take good care of my children. The funeral was a bittersweet experience. People came from all over town who remembered my father fondly, hugging me and telling me how much I looked like him. But throughout the ceremony, I felt as if I were watching everything from the outside, as if I were a spectator at a stranger's funeral. After the burial, as the whole family gathered at my mother's house for the traditional lunch, I found myself listening to conversations that didn't fully include me. They talked about local politics, the country's economic problems, people I no longer knew. When I tried to contribute to the conversation with anecdotes from my life in the United States, I saw politely interested but clearly disconnected faces. My 15-year-old nephew, my younger brother's son, asked me a question that stayed with me for days. Aunt Esperanza, is it true that in the United States people throw food away because they have too much? I explained that yes, there was a lot of abundance, but also a lot of waste. And I saw in his eyes a mixture of fascination and disgust that made me reflect on the contradictions of the life I had built. That night, alone in my old room that my mother now used for storage, I realized a painful truth. I was no longer completely Mexican, but I wasn't American either. I was something in between, something that had no name, something that didn't completely belong anywhere. After 3 weeks in Mexico, I made the most difficult decision of my life: to return to the United States and risk not being allowed back in. My mother cried when I told her, begged me to stay, asked me what was more important, my blood family or my American family. "Mom, my children need me," I explained. "They've been in the United States for 10 years. It's their home. I can't abandon them." "And don't I need you?" she asked with tears in her eyes. "Of course you do, Mom. But they're still little. You have Carmen and my brothers. My children only have me." It was a justification that sounded logical, but the truth was more complicated. The truth was that after 3 weeks in Mexico, I realized I no longer knew how to live here. I had grown accustomed to American efficiency, to having hot water 24 hours a day, to being able to plan my day without worrying about power outages or water shortages. I had grown accustomed to financial independence, to making my own decisions, to being the strong woman I had discovered I could be. But more than anything, I had realized that my children really needed me, perhaps more than I had thought. Roberto had called me every day to tell me how they were doing, and I could hear in his voice that they were struggling with my absence. Alejandro's grades had dropped, and Maria had started throwing tantrums she hadn't had in years. The day before my return trip, I visited my father's grave for the last time. I spoke to him as if he could hear me, explaining why I had to leave, and asking for forgiveness for not being more present in his final years. "Dad, I don't know if I'll ever see you again," I said to the cold tombstone. "I don't know if I'll be able to come back to visit your grave. But I want you to know that everything I've achieved is because you taught me to be strong." That night, My mother helped me pack the few things I was taking with me. Some photos, a shawl that had belonged to my grandmother, and a clay pot in which my mother cooked the most delicious beans in the world. "So you won't forget the taste of home," she said as she wrapped the pot in newspaper. The flight back to Phoenix was a roller coaster of emotions. On the one hand, I was desperate to see my children, to hug them and make sure they were okay. On the other hand, I was terrified that they wouldn't let me into the country, that everything I had built in 10 years would vanish in an instant. When the plane landed in Phoenix and I saw the Arizona desert mountains, I had a strange feeling. It was relief, but also sadness. It was like coming home, but also like arriving in a strange place. At immigration, my heart was beating so hard, I thought it was going to jump out of my chest. The officer checked my Mexican passport, asked me questions about the purpose of my trip, about how long I'd been away. I explained my father's situation, showed him the death certificate, told him about my children waiting for me. After what seemed like an eternity, he stamped my passport and said, "Welcome back, ma'am. My condolences on your father's passing." When I left the immigration area and saw Roberto waiting for me with the children, I began to cry as I had never cried in my life. But they weren't just tears of joy. They were tears of confusion, of loss, of a sadness I couldn't explain. Alejandro had grown in the 3 weeks I was away. He looked taller and more mature. Maria had cut her hair and looked older. They both hugged me with an intensity that confirmed I had made the right decision in coming back. But during the car ride home, as they told me about school and their friends, I realized something that broke my heart. They spoke exclusively in English, even to me. It was as if they had decided, consciously or not, that Spanish was part of a world they no longer belonged to. That night, lying in my bed in Phoenix, staring at the ceiling of the room that now felt strange after sleeping in my old room in Mexico, I asked myself the question that had been tormenting me for weeks. Where was my real home? In the months following my return from Mexico, something fundamental had changed in me. On the outside, everything went back to normal. I resumed my cleaning business, the children continued with school, Roberto continued with his construction company. But inside, I felt like a ghost inhabiting a life that no longer fit me. The experience of being in Mexico had shown me a painful truth. I was no longer the same Esperanza who had left San Miguel de Allende 10 years earlier. I had changed in ways I hadn't recognized until that moment. My speech had incorporated English words without my realizing it. My expectations about efficiency, punctuality, even cleanliness had become Americanized. When my mother took an hour to make coffee because she stopped to chat with a neighbor, I felt an impatience that embarrassed me. But the most painful thing was realizing that my children had grown even further away from their Mexican roots during my absence. Roberto told me that Maria had cried one night, saying she didn't want me to go back to Mexico because she was afraid I wouldn't come back. But she was also afraid to go because there was nothing for her there. Alejandro, for his part, had started asking more mature questions about our legal status in the country. He asked me directly if we could be deported one day, if he could go to college as the son of illegal immigrants, if he would always have to hide the fact that he was born in Mexico. "Why don't we get our papers in order, Mom?" he asked me one afternoon while doing his homework. "It's very complicated, my love," I replied, although the truth was that we had been putting off that decision for years, living in a gray area that gave us some stability but no real security. At 40, I found myself in an existential crisis that had no name in either of the two languages I spoke. It was something deeper than the normal midlife crisis. It was the crisis of someone who had built their identity between two cultures without belonging completely to either. I started going to therapy with a Mexican-American psychologist named Dr. Patricia Ruiz, who understood the complexities of living between two worlds. In our sessions, we spoke in a mixture of Spanish and English that felt natural but also symbolized my inner confusion. "What do you miss most about Mexico?" she asked me in one of our first sessions. "I miss the person I was when I lived there," I replied. "I miss the simplicity of knowing who I was, where I came from, where I belonged." "And what do you like most about your life here?" "The independence, the opportunities for my children, the feeling that I can be whoever I want to be. But that freedom also terrifies me, because it means my children can decide not to be Mexican at all." Dr. Ruiz helped me understand that what I was experiencing was normal for immigrants, especially women who had sacrificed so much to give their children a better life. She explained that identity wasn't fixed, that it could be fluid, that it could evolve. But understanding my situation intellectually didn't ease the emotional pain of feeling rootless. Interestingly, it was during this period of my own crisis that my children began to ask questions about their Mexican heritage. Alejandro, who was already 16, had to write an essay for school about his family history. And he came to ask me about our trip to the desert, about what life had been like in Mexico. For the first time in years, he sat with me and listened to stories about his grandparents, about family traditions, about the meals I used to cook when he was little. But there was something painful about his curiosity. It was the curiosity of someone studying a foreign culture, not of someone reconnecting with his own roots. Maria, now 14, had begun to notice the differences between our family and her friends' completely American families. She asked me why we had never traveled to visit our grandparents, why we didn't have family photos from when we were little, why I sometimes got sad when I heard Mexican music on the radio. "Mom, do you regret bringing us here?" she asked me one night over dinner. The question took me by surprise. "Why do you ask that, sweetheart?" "Because sometimes you seem sad, like you're missing something we can't give you." His perception amazed and hurt me at the same time. It was true that there was a melancholy in me that my children could feel but not fully understand. "I don't regret it," I told him honestly. "But it's complicated. There are beautiful things we lost when we came here, and there are beautiful things we gained. Sometimes it's hard to know if the balance is worth it." That conversation marked the beginning of something new in our family. We started talking more openly about our history, about the decisions we had made, about the losses and gains of immigration. A year after my father's death, my mother had a stroke. Carmen called me from the hospital to tell me that she had lost the use of her right side and needed constant care. For the second time in 2 years, I was faced with the possibility of having to travel to Mexico. But this time, the situation was different. "You can't keep going back and forth," Roberto told me one night as we discussed the options. "It's too risky. What if they don't let you come back this time?" He was right. But the thought of my mother being alone and sick tore me apart. I called a more expensive and experienced immigration lawyer who explained the options for regularizing our legal status. "You're going to need a family petition, but the process can take years and there are no guarantees," he explained. "The other option is to leave the country voluntarily and apply from Mexico, but that would mean separating the family for an indefinite period of time." That night, Roberto and I had the most honest conversation of our 18 years of marriage. We laid all our cards on the table, Our fears, our hopes, our regrets, our dreams for the future. "What do you really want, Esperanza?" he asked me. "If you could design our perfect life, what would it look like?" "I want my children to have every opportunity this country can give them," I replied. "But I also want them to know where they come from, to not be ashamed of being Mexican, to understand that their roots are part of their strength." "And you? What do you want for yourself?" It was a question I hadn't asked myself in years, always focused on the well-being of my family above my own. "I want to feel like I belong somewhere," I said, finally verbalizing the pain I had been carrying. "I want to be able to visit my father's grave without risking my future. I want my children to know their grandmother before it's too late." After months of legal consultations, family discussions, and much reflection, we made a decision that changed our lives forever. We were going to begin the legal process to regularize our status, no matter how long it took or how much it cost. The first step was controversial. I had to leave the country voluntarily to apply from Mexico, which meant temporarily separating the family. Roberto and the children would stay in Phoenix to keep the business and the stability of the life we had built. "How long?" Alejandro asked when we explained the plan. "We don't know," I replied honestly. "It could be a few months, it could be a year or more. But it's the only way to do things right." Maria cried. "Why can't we stay as we are? We're fine like this." "Because fine isn't enough," I explained. "We want to be safe. We want to be able to travel. We want to be able to visit you when you have children of your own. We want to stop living in fear." The decision to leave for Mexico again, this time with a different purpose, was heartbreaking, but also liberating. It was the first time in years that I felt like I was taking control of my destiny instead of simply reacting to circumstances. My second return to Mexico was completely different from the first. This time, I wasn't fleeing an emergency, but building a bridge to the future. I arrived in San Miguel de Allende with a clear mission: to take care of my mother while I waited for my immigration case to be resolved, but also to reconnect with my roots in a conscious and deliberate way. My mother had lost a lot of mobility after her stroke, but her mind was still sharp. When she saw me arrive with my suitcases and explained that I was going to stay for an indefinite period of time, her eyes filled with tears of happiness. "Are my grandchildren going to come visit me?" was the first thing she asked me. "Yes, Mom. As soon as we get the paperwork sorted out, they'll be able to come and meet their grandmother." During the first few weeks, I focused on establishing a care routine for my mother and familiarizing myself with life in my hometown again. But this time, instead of feeling like a stranger, I consciously decided to look for ways to reconnect. I started cooking the traditional recipes my mother had taught me as a child, but had forgotten during my years in the United States. I went back to the market on Saturdays, chatting with the vendors, haggling over prices, and carrying my vegetables in cloth bags like I used to. I also started volunteering at the local health center, using the administrative skills I had developed in my cleaning business to help organize files and appointments. It was my way of contributing to the community while I waited. Every Sunday afternoon, Roberto and the kids would call me on Skype. Seeing their faces on the computer screen I had bought to keep in touch filled me with joy and sadness at the same time. I could see how they were growing and changing without me. Alejandro showed me his school projects, his college applications, his plans for the future. He had decided to study civil engineering, inspired by his father's construction work, but with bigger aspirations. "Mom, I want to build bridges." he told me during one of our calls. Real bridges, but also bridges between communities, between cultures. His choice of career excited me because I felt it was his way of honoring our family history of building connections between two worlds. Maria had developed her artistic talent and showed me her paintings through the camera. She had begun to incorporate Mexican elements into her art. Vibrant colors, pre-Hispanic symbols, landscapes she vaguely remembered from her early childhood. "Do you like it, Mom?" she asked, showing me a painting of a woman carrying a little girl walking through a desert under a starry sky. "It's beautiful, my love." "What does it represent?" "It's us," he said simply. When we crossed over to find Dad, I realized that despite my fears, my children had not completely lost their connection to their history. They had transformed it, made it their own in a way I hadn't expected. But it was still there. The immigration process turned out to be more complicated and longer than any of us had anticipated. My lawyer in Phoenix worked closely with a lawyer in Mexico City to ensure that all the documents were in order. I had to gather birth certificates, marriage certificates, proof of Roberto's income, evidence that he had no criminal record, letters of recommendation from employers and community members. Each document required time, money, and multiple trips to government offices. During the months of waiting, I had a strange experience. For the first time in more than a decade, I had time to reflect on who I was, without the constant pressure to work, to survive, to constantly build toward the future. I started writing. At first, it was just personal notes about my experience. But then they turned into long letters to my children, explaining our family history in more detail than I had ever shared before. I wrote to them about their grandparents, about family traditions, about the reasons behind every decision we had made. I also started giving talks at the community center for families who were considering emigrating. I told them my whole story, the successes and failures, the gains and losses, the complex reality of immigrant life that goes beyond dreams of economic prosperity. Emigration isn't just about changing countries, I told them. It's about changing your soul, and you have to be prepared for that transformation. After 8 months in Mexico, I received the call I had been waiting for. My visa had been approved. I could return to the United States as a legal permanent resident, which meant I would finally have the freedom to travel between the two countries without fear. The news came at a bittersweet time. My mother had suffered another minor stroke, and her health had deteriorated considerably. The doctors didn't think she had much longer to live, and I was once again faced with an impossible decision: stay with her in her final days, or return to my teenage children who needed me at a crucial time in their lives. My mother, with the wisdom of someone who had lived a long life and lost a lot, made the decision for me. "Go to your children," she said one afternoon as I fed her. "I've lived my life. Your children are just beginning theirs. They need their mother." "But Mom, what if I die? I'll die knowing you did the right thing. And now you can come to my funeral without risking your future." Her words gave me the peace I needed to make the decision to return. My return to Phoenix in December 2015 was unlike any trip I had ever taken before. For the first time in more than 15 years, I walked through immigration at the airport as a legal person, with rights, with the freedom to come and go. Roberto and the children were waiting for me with a banner that read, "Welcome home, Mom," in Spanish and English. When I saw them, I realized how much they had grown in those 8 months. Alejandro was now 17 and looked like a young man. María, 15, había desarrollado una elegancia adolescente que me recordaba a mí mismo en esa edad. But what struck me most was realizing that when they hugged me, they spoke to me in Spanish. They had been practicing during my absence, preparing for my return. "Mom, we really miss your Mexican food," Maria said in imperfect but loving Spanish. "And we want you to teach us Grandma's recipes," added Alejandro. During the trip home, they told me about the changes they had made in my absence. They had converted part of the basement into an altar with photos of my parents and other relatives who had died. They had started celebrating the Day of the Dead, something we had never done in the United States. "We wanted to feel more connected to you while you were gone," Roberto explained. "And we realized we also wanted to feel more connected to our history." In the months after I returned, our family found a new balance. We were no longer completely Mexican or completely American. We were something new, something hybrid, something uniquely ours. We established new family traditions that incorporated elements of both cultures. We celebrated Thanksgiving, but with mole instead of turkey. We made tamales at Christmas, but also gingerbread cookies. The kids spoke English with their friends, but Spanish at home, and they were no longer ashamed of either language. Alejandro was accepted to several universities and decided to study at Arizona State University, close to home. His application essay was about his experience as the son of immigrants and how that had shaped his desire to build literal and figurative bridges. Maria continued to develop her art, but now she did so with a deeper cultural awareness. Her paintings explored themes of identity, migration, and belonging in ways that surprised me with their maturity. My cleaning business had grown during my absence under the management of my employees, and when I returned, I decided to expand it into consulting for small businesses in the Latino community. I used the skills I had developed in my own immigration process to help other families. Roberto and I also rediscovered our relationship. The years of stress over legal status, work, and raising children in two cultures had put a strain on our marriage that we hadn't fully recognized. But my time in Mexico and our reunification process helped us rediscover each other as a couple. For the first time in a long time, we started going out on Fridays, just the two of us, to have coffee or walk in the park. We talked without the pressure of fear or exhaustion. We laughed as we remembered stories from our courtship, our first weeks in the United States, and the scares and joys that life here had brought us. We began to see the future with new hope, less based on fear and more on shared dreams. We talked about someday building a small house in San Miguel to spend long periods of time when we are old. About traveling together, showing our grandchildren both countries, teaching them from an early age that you can have two roots and flourish. I have learned that exile does not end when the migrant crosses the border or even when they manage to establish a dignified life in the new country. True exile is internal. It is uprooting, nostalgia, the constant negotiation between here and there. For a long time, I believed that the greatest danger was deportation. That constant threat that robbed me of sleep every time I heard a police siren or saw an immigration van. But arriving in Mexico and realizing that I was a stranger in my own country, that the customs and even the smells had become foreign to me, hurt much more than any fear at the border. And yet, that invisible wound also transformed me. Only after hitting rock bottom, feeling alone on both sides, did I come to appreciate the unique richness of my experience. I understood that one can be a bridge between worlds, that it is not necessary to choose just one. You can belong to two, even if it hurts sometimes. My identity is the result of the sum, not the subtraction, of my stories. For all the migrants who hear my story, I want to share some lessons that life and distance taught me with tears and smiles. Take care of your roots. Don't stop speaking your language at home. Tell your children where they come from. Roots are not lost if they are watered, even if new branches grow. Don't be ashamed of your scars. Every journey leaves marks. Some hurt, others make you stronger. They are a testament to your courage and your desire for the future. Build a community. Don't live your pain in silence. Connect with other migrants, share the burden and also the achievements. Remember that home is mobile. I learned that home is more about the people who love you than the place where you were born. You can love two lands, two cultures, two cuisines, two types of music. Don't lose yourself. In pursuing the American dream, don't let your heart forget the music, laughter, and food of your childhood. There is enormous strength in preserving your essence, even if your accent or surroundings change. It wasn't easy, quick, or painless. There were nights of deep loneliness, moments of regret, days when I wanted to give up. But there were also small miracles. Seeing my children rebuild their identity, finally feeling entitled to rest, knowing that I can walk through the airport without fear. There is something I want to ask you if you have made it this far. If my story resonated with you, share yours. Speak up, shout, write your story. Don't let silence erase what you lived through or what made you grow. Your story is valuable because it is unique, and no one better than you to leave your mark on the world. If I have learned anything in all these years, it is that migrant life is made up of losses, but also of new beginnings. Of nostalgia, yes, but above all, of an unbreakable strength that only those who have crossed external borders and internal ones, which hurt even more, know. Share your experience in the comments below. Subscribe to this channel and help me make more voices like yours and mine heard, so that no one ever feels alone in a foreign land again. Because together, even from a distance, we also make a community. We also make a home. We are also family. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for letting me into your heart, even if only for a little while. And remember, wherever you are not and never will be a stranger. There is always someone else who understands what you are carrying. See you soon.